And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Preterist Apologetics. That's Mike Sullivan over there. I'm Don Preston, and we are thrilled to death to be able to be with you once again. And we're going to pick up tonight on where we left off last week. And before we do that, Mike, I can't be with you next week. I have surgery next week. I have cataract surgery. And the doctor told me, he said, I do not want you sitting in front of a computer, period, end of story. I don't want you reading. I said, what am I supposed to do? This is
That's
what
your
I
life,
do.
man.
That's my life. I said, yeah. And he said, don't turn the TV on unless you have to. And I said, so you want me to sit in a dark room with a patch over my eye, evidently. I'm only having one eye operated on at this particular time. And he said, well, all I know is here's what I don't want you doing. I said, for a solid week? He said, yeah.
Wow.
And so I said, well, okay. I said, in the meantime, I said, I guess that will give me a good opportunity to let my voice rest for a week. And so I'm not filming it all next week. And I literally, Mike, I don't know if I can not read or, you know.
That's going to be rough for you.
Boy, it's just going, because I got 3 brand new books ordered that I'm just foaming at the mouth. Mark Nanos, Romans through Jewish eyes, Corinthians through Roman eyes, Jewish eyes, and another one, something like that, or Paul through Jewish eyes. Now, Mark Nanos is an excellent scholar. His book, The Mystery of God in Romans, is just wonderful, except for the fact that he believes that Jesus predicted the end of the world, and of course he failed. So he's one of those typical higher critical guys, you know.
Didn't he do something on Galatians? Or no?
I don't remember that, but he possibly did. But yeah, he's very, very good. He's extremely heavy into reading the epistles through the Judaic Hebraic perspective. Why did Peter and the New Testament writers quote from the Old Testament so much? Why did they echo the Old Testament so much in their writings? If God was through with Israel, etc. And so he does a marvelous job of that. The book that I mentioned a moment ago, The Mystery of God in Romans, he considers Acts a great deal, and he points out that the prevalent view on Acts and Romans, both for that matter, was, well, Israel failed in her calling, so God cut her off, and the calling of the Gentiles was a sure sign of Israel's failure. And he said, that's just blatantly false. He said the calling of the Gentiles was always the purpose of God. He foreordained that Israel would no longer be his exclusive people.
Now, is he the one that was teaching maybe in Acts 21, where Paul is and the Christian Jews are still keeping the law of Moses for a period?
Yes.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, he is. But he's very big on this, of pointing out the continuing observance of the law throughout the testamental period, you know, what we call the transitional period, of course. So it's very, very well worth reading. And if you don't have it, I highly recommend it. So I can't wait to get my hands on these 3 books. They're all due in next week.
Nice. I can't wait to get your book.
Oh, we mailed it. We mailed it.
Good.
Yeah. So I think we did. I asked Jan if we mailed it. Look, we've been mailing out, you know, books every single morning, 10, 12, 15, 20 books and what have you. So I don't remember every one of them that we sent out. But anyway, you'll be getting it very shortly.
Cool.
I mean, shortly. And so, okay. Well, folks, last week, and of course, last week's program is in the context of the Hamas invasion of Israel, the slaughtering of 1,400 people, Israel's retaliation, and how the dispensational world is just on fire, saying, well, this is it. This is proof positive. We're in the last days. The rapture is right around the corner. And boy, Mike, I got to tell you, you talk about a stunning development, a major minister in the Churches of Christ Fellowship out of Houston. Man, his name just went right over my head. But anyway, he's had several, I'm talking New York bestseller books, right? Now, mind you, his bestsellers are touchy feely. Let's all hug together and sing Kumbaya. There's not a lot of
Seven steps to a victorious Christian life or something.
amen. So there's not just a ton of substance, but he has recently come out saying the very next step in God's plan is the rapture. For a Church of Christ guy to do that, it's just like, holy cow, that's just almost unheard of. And so it was stunning. Now, I do know that some people have sent him some of my books. Obviously, he has not read them or doesn't care or what have you. But nonetheless, in all of this hoopla concerning Israel and Hamas and the horrific situation that's going on over there, and make no mistake, folks, neither Mike and I approve of the violence that's going on over there, the slaughter of innocent people. It's just, I don't care whether you're pro-Palestinian at the moment or whether you're pro-Israel. I'm just set all that aside. The killing of women and children because you hate the other side, because you don't think the other side is even human. How hateful can you get? I mean, it's just absolutely awful. So let's make sure that that's clearly
Well,
understood.
yeah, and it comes back to eschatology. When you look at the Quran, the eschatology is violent and it calls for war. It calls for holy war. And when you study the Talmud, it's not any different. They believe they're going to bring in their Messiah through having continuous war with Christians and Muslims. So this is what you get. And this is why eschatology is so important. And that's why Don and I are like, look, this is not Jesus's eschatology. We have nothing to do with any of that. But if you're a evangelical Zionist, your eschatology demands that you support bloodshed.
That's right.
And I've listened to Michael Brown trying to hem and haw and justify and wiggle and dance and try and get away from the implications of his premillennial Zionism. But push comes to shove, they have to support that nonsense.
Well, and let's face it, in the Talmud that you mentioned and in other rabbinic sources as well, they just openly call, and they say the killing of a Gentile is like killing an animal. It doesn't matter.
It's an act of worship to God, it actually says.
Actually, yes. And most people, I would say about 11 out of 10 people do not know how grossly violent and vile and immoral the Talmud is.
I know.
And so when people hear people such as you and me point out bad eschatology is at the root and the core and the cause of what's going on in Israel today, and they hear us talk about how violent the Talmud is, how the Quran is, they're going, where are you guys getting this? Well, yeah, the fact is 11 out of 10 people do not take the time to study, to research, and they hear these prominent dispensational ministers who are sold out lock, stock, and barrel to the Zionist concept. They go so far as to say, when they are asked, well, how can you support Israel when they're killing Palestinian Christians to take over their land? Jerry Falwell went on record as saying, well, it's unfortunate, but after all, the land belongs to them. And so they're justified in whatever means that they feel is necessary to take over the land. Oh, so killing Christians is okay as long as you're a Jew.
Yeah.
This is horrid.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, they actually think that they have the same mandates that Israel of the Old Testament had.
Yes.
So if that's your theology and your eschatology, everything is justified. And if you're a dispensational Zionist, you have to say, well, that prophecy has to be fulfilled. And even though they get their hands a little bloody, I have to kind of, in some indirect way, support it because it's just destined to happen before I can get raptured. And, I'm the center of the universe and I have to get raptured. So,
Right.
let's get this show on the road.
And this very idea has permeated American politics for generations now. I well remember a very noted Oklahoma senator stood on the floor of the Senate several years ago now, is back during the 70s, and he said, and this is during the time of the Yom Kippur War, if I remember correctly, but he stood on the floor of the Senate and he said, it is America's God-ordained responsibility to, this is his word, unconditionally support Israel no matter what. That land belongs to them. They are God's chosen people. We must support them no matter what. And I just, you almost want to cringe. You want to roll up into the fetal position, or you want to stand up and shout, "Let me talk for a while."
Yeah.
It's absolutely abhorrent. So we say all of that to bring us back to this issue of why the dispensationalists are, in some instances, excited about what's going on over there, because they believe that we're living in the time of the end. Armageddon is just around the corner. But what we are trying to do, first of all, trying to bring some sanity to this entire discussion. And most of all, we're trying to present the truth about, quote, the war that the Old Testament predicted for the last days. Now, remember, folks, dispensationalists say we're living in the last days. Okay? So they have to believe that something related to Israel and war is the lead in to Armageddon, or it is the initiation of Armageddon and Gog and Magog. Now, we should point out that in some dispensational circles, not all, but in some dispensational circles, they delineate between Armageddon and Gog and Magog. I don't believe you can delineate. I think they're one and the same thing. The ancient rabbis said they were the same thing. They taught that they were the same thing. I think when you examine Revelation 16, 19, 20, I think it's easy to demonstrate that they're the same thing. So last week, what we did, we began in Daniel chapter 9.
No, not yet. We did Isaiah 2 and 4. We haven't done Daniel yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's exactly right. What we did, we looked at Isaiah chapters 2 through 4. Now, very quickly, we're not going to go over it thoroughly as we did last week, but we do want to make the point by way of reiteration. Isaiah 2 through 4, united prophecy. It's joined together by the little term "in that day." It's set in the last days, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, and consummates in the day of the Lord, when the Lord would arise to shake the earth mightily, Isaiah chapter 2, 19 to 21. But that day of the Lord would be a time of famine. It would be a time of famine, no water, no bread in Jerusalem, Isaiah chapter 3. It would be the time in which God would stand up to judge the elders of his people, Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 13. It would be the time in which women would join themselves, 10 women would join themselves to one man and say, we'll cook our own food, we'll wear our own clothes, but just let us be called by your name. And I got to say this, when I was a young man, Mike, I encountered some Mormons who used that passage to justify polygamy. And I was like, what? Now, believe you me, at the time, I didn't understand even the first syllable of preterism, but I knew that was not right. The reason 10 women would join themselves to one man is because
war. Yeah.
War.
Men would be short in
short supply of men. That's right.
Exactly.
And of course, in the ancient times, to be unmarried, it was catastrophic for a woman. She had no means of support. And so to eat, to support herself, 10 women joined themselves to one man. It would also be the time in which, now the King James Version, New King James Version, uses the definite article, and I think there's good reason for it, even though it's not in the Septuagint. But the definite article is not used in Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 25 and 26, when it says, your men shall fall by the edge of the sword in the war. Okay. Again, the definite article is not used. But after all, war is the context. It's a time of siege. It's a time of warfare. It is a time of the, pardon me, of the war. So we have the last days, we have the day of the Lord when Israel's men would fall by the edge of the sword. We have Jesus in Luke chapter 20, verse 21, verse 24, directly echoing Isaiah chapter 20, Isaiah chapter 2, 19 to 21, and 3, 25 and 26, saying, in his prediction of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, what's amazing is even dispensationalists agree with that. So here's Jesus echoing Isaiah chapter 3, verse 25. Your men shall fall by the edge of the sword. Luke 21, 24, AD 70. Your men shall fall by the edge of the sword. Here is Jesus' interpretation of the last days war. Really, honestly, that's enough to prove the entire point that we're not living in the last days. The last days were in the first century in the war against the AD 70 judgment on Jerusalem. I mean,
Now,
that's Jesus' application. Go ahead.
Now, before I'd asked you, in that day, is that referring to the last day? But I guess what I meant to say is the day of the Lord. Would the specific day of the Lord be the last day of the last days? Because I mean, that seems to have a little bit more nuance to it, a little bit more definitiveness, if that's a word, to it than, that generic in that day, which could cover the already and not yet. But
well, and I think it's a very good question. It's like I told you, I've pondered on it a great deal. I have not come up with a hard, fast definition. I think what you're saying has a certain degree of validity to it, that it's the very climactic day of the last days. It's the last day, so to speak, that John uses throughout his gospel, that Jesus or that Daniel referred to in Daniel chapter 12, that in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 13, Daniel shall go your way. You shall sleep with your fathers. And at the end of the days, well, that's the last day because 1,290 days, 1,335 days is the total countdown until the time of the resurrection. And here's Daniel being told he's going to rest until the end of the days.
Let me read to you. Let me read to you what Carson and Beale say. Now, remember, I wrote to you a while back saying, hey, look, Beale and Carson don't only say that the Old Testament echo to 2 Thessalonians 1, 5 through 10 is Isaiah 2, but they also say 1 Thessalonians 4:16 is also an echo of Isaiah 2. They say the main clause of 1 Thessalonians 4:16, because the Lord himself will come down from heaven, unquote, recalls prophetic literature of the Old Testament that envisions the day of the Lord, when God will come to judge the wicked and save the righteous. And he cites Isaiah 2, 10 through 12. So, and everybody, of course, takes that passage as the last day.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's interesting that they make, we were talking about why don't these guys, these partial preterists, go to the Old Testament passages that these New Testament authors are referring to? And this is why, because they link these same Old Testament passages that some of them say are referring to AD 70 with other passages that they say are the end of world history. And it gets them in all kinds of gymnastical.
Well, one explanation that I have been given, and honest to goodness, this was given to me in all earnestness. Now, I say in all earnestness, it was given to me in the midst of a written dialogue with a couple of different people on my YouTube channel when I pointed out how the New Testament writers were appealing to these Old Testament prophecies of the last days, how Paul in Romans 9 through 11 particularly draws upon so many Old Testament prophecies, for crying out loud. Isaiah 27, Isaiah 59, Psalm 69, Psalms 110. I mean, you just go on and on and on about the passages that Paul quotes, all of which, by the way, all of which are passages that foretold judgment on Israel in the last days for shedding innocent blood.
Yes.
And so when I pointed that context out, they said, well, you have to understand that the New Testament writers lifted those quotes out of their context and used them for their purposes. So I said, in other words, you're accusing the New Testament writers literally of cherry picking, of proof texting. And of course, this is exactly what Steve Gregg does in his book, Why Not Full Preterism. He admits that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 55 and 56, then shall be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. Yeah, that's Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. Now, here's the remarkable thing about my friend's admitting that Paul is quoting from Isaiah 25, 8. Steve Gregg admits that Isaiah 25, 1 to 7 predicted the first century events consummating in AD 70.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
But verse 8, these are his terms, is a parenthetical, independent prophecy unrelated to the context.
Says him, huh?
Says him. And he even says, rather boldly in my estimation, a solid or a good case can be made that it is a parenthetical, independent prophecy inserted into the context. He never offered that good argument. You know, he just simply said a good case can be made. Well, if you're going to say a good case can be made, please give it. Make that case. So these are the extents to which futurists will often go when they're cornered with the reality that the New Testament writers are quoting from these Old Testament texts. And the Old Testament texts demonstrably speak of the first century and the judgment on Old Covenant Israel for shedding innocent blood. All of a sudden, first of all, we're the ones accused of heresy and abusing Scripture. But then they just tell us, no, the New Testament writers are cherry picking. The New Testament writers, as Michael Brown said in one of my debates with him, the New Testament writers got it wrong. They misapplied those Old Testament prophecies. I mean, this is stunning stuff. And as I like to say, I like to use my little non-Latin term, this is argumentum ad desperatum. If you don't have an exegetical argument to make, then make something up.
Yeah. Well, real quick, because we didn't hit this last week, and I kind of found it profound as I was reading Isaiah 2 through 5, is the second Exodus motif, especially after saying what I said about 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 5 of chapter 4. Then the Lord will create over the whole side of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day and a smoke and a shining of a fiery fire by night. For over all the glory there will be a canopy. There will be a booth for shade by day from the heat and for a refuge and a shelter from the storm and rain. So we have a few eschatological themes here. We have the second Exodus motif. Mm-hmm. We have, I believe, the marriage motif.
Yes.
This Hebrew word for canopy is what the Jews would use to, when they would have a wedding.
It's the sukkah. The sukkah.
And Exodus 19 through 24 is understood to be the marriage when God made a covenant and married Old Covenant Israel. And your book here, I was thinking, we shall meet the Lord in the air, and the subtitle, the wedding of the King of Kings, tying 1 Thessalonians 4 in this with a cloud and the second Exodus. Now there's no trumpet mentioned here, but we know Isaiah 27, 12 to 13 mentions that trumpet. Mm-hmm. But remember, at the first Exodus, there was the trumpet, there was the gathering at Mount Sinai, and we had the cloud, and we had Moses ascending into the glory cloud. And so it just brings images of Hebrews 12, coming to Mount Zion. You had mentioned Isaiah 25, the marriage is at the top of Mount Zion. And 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, the Feast of Tabernacles, the living and the dead come together in God's presence to be with him forever, to dwell with him forever. So I just thought, since Beale and Carson are connecting 1 Thessalonians 4:16 with Isaiah 2, the same coming of the Lord as 2 Thessalonians 1, 5-9. I just thought we might just kind of touch on that real quick.
Well, I think you've already done a great job of it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. All of these motifs, like you said, they're just cram-packed. I believe it's John Watt in his Word Biblical Commentary on Isaiah brings out the second Exodus motif there. If I'm not, I think it's John Watt in that particular commentary. Pretty sure it is. But numerous commentators have seen that connection of the second Exodus, that language that is used there and the promise. They've also seen the wedding motif. I believe it's Tom Holland in his divine marriage, Romans, the divine marriage, makes a connection with Isaiah, if I'm not mistaken. And so some scholars have definitely seen, none of which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, none of which are preterists. Okay. Preterists have not made this up.
Right.
This is from the world of scholarship of men who are intimately familiar with these motifs, with these concepts. And what Mike and I and other preterists are doing is say, you're exactly right. We amen this. Now let's just carry that forward and let's be consistent with it. Since this is what the New Testament writers are drawing on, you know, and of course, one of the great tragedies is, and this is the environment that I was raised in, pardon me, as a fifth generation member of the Churches of Christ. In the Church of Christ, one of the foundational doctrines is God was through with Israel at the cross. God was through with the old law at the cross. And to refer to Steve Gregg again, once again, in his book, Why Not Full Preterism, he says Don Preston makes too much of a case about the importance of the feast days and about Israel being the keynote of eschatology. He said Israel had her time, and her time was like, you know, just a little bitty sliver of time out of the whole flow of history. But God finished his promises to Israel. That doesn't mean he fulfilled all of his eschatological promises. Of course, the very first time I read that, I'm going, there is one hope.
Right.
You know, as I presented in my debate with Joel McDermott, and bless his heart, he ran from that, tried to say, no, there's multiple hopes. No, there's one eschatological hope. There's one eschatological hope. So to do as Steve Gregg does and to say Israel had her eschatological hope, which, by the way, I wonder what Israel's eschatological hope might have been. Acts chapter 26. For the hope of the promise of the resurrection, am I on trial this day? Acts 23. Acts 26, concerning the hope of the resurrection, to which hope our 12 tribes hope to attain.
And he mentions the 12 tribes again in Acts 20, 25, 14.
Yes.
Right before he talks about the resurrection of the just and the unjust about to take place. So you've got to have the resurrection taking place during the time of the 12 tribes, which is clearly what the book of Revelation points out as well. So, yeah, and there is only one hope. I remember that debate with Joel when you got him in 1 Corinthians 15. It's like, no, Paul is combining Adamic eschatology with Israel's eschatology. And he said, well, yeah, I can, I might give that to you, but we still have to have that physical phase of the Adamic. It's like it just didn't register at all. I mean, he would not be bound to the actual text itself.
Well, and he even went so far as to say there's actually a way in which I could admit, due to the language of imminence of 1 Corinthians 15, that there was an application or fulfillment in AD 70, but we're still waiting for the real one. Well, maybe we're waiting for another typological fulfillment that will point to the real one.
Right.
I mean,
it never ends.
It never ends. Okay, so Isaiah chapter 2 lays the groundwork. And it tells about this day of the Lord in which men would run to the hills, hide in the caves, cry to the rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the glory of the Lord and from the terror of his presence. Very, very quickly. Jesus in Luke chapter 23, as he's being led to his crucifixion, turned to the women who were weeping and wailing over his impending death and said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. If they do these things in a green tree, what will they do in a dry. In other words, if they're going to do this kind of thing, when there's peace and prosperity and what have you, what are they going to do when hard times come? Yeah, he knew what was coming, but he said the time is coming in which they will cry to the rocks, fall on us. As I pointed out last week, that's a conflation of Isaiah chapter 2 and Hosea 10, verse 8, which is the direct parallel with Isaiah chapter 2. So someone texted me or sent me a blog post and said, Don, where do you see Jesus citing Isaiah in Luke chapter 23? Well, it's actually a conflation of Isaiah 2 and Hosea chapter 10. So I want to make that straight. So my point is, here is Jesus in a passage, as we noted last week, that scholars agree he was talking about the coming destruction. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul quotes from the same identical verses that Jesus applied to AD 70 in his prediction, prophecy, and promise to the Thessalonians that they were going to get relief from their then ongoing persecution when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those that do not know God, that do not obey his gospel. These shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and the glory of his presence. A direct citation from Isaiah chapter 2. Mike, we posed the hermeneutical question last week. Upon what authority can we say, okay, yes, Jesus quoted from Isaiah chapter 2, verse 9 and 10, 19 to 21, part A. Paul quoted from the same identical verses in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Oh, but we know, of course, that Paul's talking about something totally different from what Jesus applied it to. Where's the hermeneutic here?
Let me, on that note, and of course, I pointed out, and as well, that Keith Matheson does take 2 Thessalonians 1 as AD 70. And he appeals to the contemporary situation. They're being persecuted. They would receive relief. Now, that's a very refreshing admission. And of course, as you know as well, in Gentry's Before Jerusalem Fell, I was going through this because I'm doing a thing on the dating of Revelation. He says, he's talking about the life situation, all right, of those being persecuted in the book of Revelation. He says, how long, O Lord, talking about the martyrs, Revelation 6:10, said Walvoord's view that when Jesus eventually comes, he will come with great rapidity, would have offered no consolation to these persecuted saints. To interpret this passage to mean that some 2,000 or 3,000 years in the future, Jesus will come with great rapidity would be a mockery of their historical circumstances. Surely this is the hinge and staple of the book. When the advent of Jesus is hailed as a relief, it is no consolation to say that the relief will come suddenly, thousands of years later. And it's just like Gentry abandons this basic hermeneutical principle when we get to 2 Thessalonians 1. Not only does he ignore the Old Testament references that Paul is drawing on, he's not doing any exegesis. And that's what just really frustrates me.
Well, it frustrates and frustrates all of us who have appreciated Gentry for so very long and for all of the good that he's done in so many different ways. And yet, like you said, you see him practicing wonderful hermeneutical consistency when it comes to Revelation, the dating of Revelation, even the message of and application of Revelation, and then 100% totally abandoning it when he comes to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. It's literally stunning how inconsistent he, not just he, but others as well, because Matheson does the same thing when he comes to other passages. And you can take his hermeneutic on 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, and you can apply it realistically to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Come up with the identical application of AD 70, but of course he refuses to do that.
Yeah, I think Gentry sees maybe the train coming that Matheson didn't. And that is, and at the end of this video, folks, we're going to try and tie all this together.
We got to
But
hurry.
Second Thessalonians, I'll give a little spoiler alert. The coming of Christ in fire and judgment to give relief to the Thessalonians and give wrath and trouble to the Jewish persecutors. That coming in fire is the end of the millennium, second coming that devours the enemies of Gog and Magog or Armageddon. So if it's the end of the millennium coming of Christ, that destroys there's nothing left to
Not
it.
one shred is left. So with that in mind, let's go over there, because here's what happens in Revelation chapter 20, ladies and gentlemen. Anthony Aquino in our debate insisted that 1,000 has to mean at least 1,000. It can mean a whole bunch more than that. It kind of makes you wonder where the hermeneutic is to say, well, 1,000 has to mean at least that. It might mean 20,000 or 40 or a million.
Well, let me interject there because I went back through because Sam was giving grief and Anthony was just parroting Sam that, oh, you're taking J.K. Beale out of context. I'm not. I read it again. I am not taking Beale out of context. Beale cites Jews who took 1,000 years symbolically to refer to a very, very long time, 360,000 years, to Jews who believed the 1,000 years represented 3.5 years.
Yes. There's this whole range.
Folks, that's a lot less than 40 years. Now, he also cites Jews who believed the 1,000 years represented a literal 40 years.
Yes.
Like we do. So we have, thanks to Mr. Beale, we have an Orthodox, very accredited scholar who admits that the 1,000 years can represent doesn't have to mean longer than 1,000 years. In fact, the Jews took it to be 3 years, 40 years, 70 years.
Yep. And remember, Sam Frost was accosting preterists and claiming that we misrepresented Gregory Beale. No, we have not misrepresented him at all. We have cited him correctly. And so what Sam Frost has done, he's gone to Beale and he has picked out a little snippet and cited that to try to prove his case instead of appealing to the entirety of what Beale said.
Right. Now, Beale is not a full preterist.
No.
So since Beale is not a full preterist and he believes that we're still in the millennium, his view requires that the millennium is longer than a literal 1,000 years. But Beale's point is it does not have to be.
Right.
And in other words, he's saying his view is not necessitated.
Right.
Okay. And then when he cites Jews who took the 1,000 years symbolically to be 3 years, 40 years, 70 years, as in contrast to 360,000, he's showing you the wide range of the symbolism of 1,000 in rabbinic thought and so forth. So we're not taking him out of context. And when I showed that to Anthony, he shut up. He left. I said, look, Anthony, you can cite Beale too, because he's saying that some Jews took 1,000 years to be symbolic of a very, very long time, 360,000.
Yeah.
And I won't accuse you, Anthony, of misrepresenting Beale. You can do that,
Yeah.
These guys don't know, apparently, how you can cite a scholar that doesn't agree with you in one area, but the area you're agreeing with, you can cite them.
That's right. That's
bizarre.
Exactly right. Okay, so what we have, and this is obviously going to set the stage for next week because we've only got about 15 minutes left. We started at 5:14, I think that right. I think is right. So anyway, so in Revelation chapter 20, it's very, very important that we understand what people say. We have the martyrs, those who have been beheaded. And they are seated on thrones. They rule and they reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, Mike, it strikes me as one of the most fundamentally important elements to understand about Revelation chapter 20 is they're some of the same martyrs, if not the same, pardon me, pardon me, as in chapter 6.
Yes.
John said, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and the testimony which they held. And they cried out, How long, O Lord, holy and true, do you not avenge us on those who dwell upon the earth? And white robes were given unto them, and they were told to rest for a little while until their fellow brethren and saints should be slain as they were. Now, here we have the concept of the filling up of the measure of suffering, and thus, as a direct corollary, filling up the measure of sin on the part of their persecutors, filling up the measure of sin by killing the saints, filling up the measure of suffering on the part of the martyrs. Point being this, there are some in the preterist movement who say, well, Revelation chapter 21 to 4 is a depiction of AD 70, Christ's coming, and thus the millennium beginning in AD 70. That's not going to work. I posed a question the other day in a Facebook exchange with a friend of mine who has, I don't know if he fully accepts the premillennial preterist perspective or not, i.e. that the millennium began in AD 70. But I said, if or is Revelation 6 and the martyrs enrobed, I use that term. I don't know if that's a good, I don't know if that's a legitimate word or not, but I use it. If the martyrs that were enrobed, told to rest for a little while, are the same martyrs of Revelation chapter 20, then guess what? You can't say that Revelation chapter 20, 1 to 4 was AD 70. Why? Because AD 70 was the time of the vindication of the martyrs, but wait, in Revelation 6, those martyrs were waiting for the coming of the Lord. So if they're the same set of martyrs, Revelation 6 says the martyrs were waiting for the day of the Lord because the number of martyrs was not full yet. Therefore, judgment was not ready to fall yet. But if you make that to be Revelation chapter 20, then Revelation chapter 21 to 4 is the coming of the Lord in judgment, and it's the destruction of Jerusalem at that point. And it's the destruction of Satan, the persecutors. But wait a minute, that doesn't work, because everyone that I know of, I don't know if anybody disagrees with this, every commentator I believe I've ever read posits the destruction of Satan, the great persecutor, where? Oh, at the end of the millennium. So you can't have AD 70 in verses 1 through 4 being the coming of the Lord in the judgment of the persecutor, because chapter 20, 10 and following has the destruction of the persecutor after the millennium.
Don, isn't this a very similar problem that we have with partial and even some full preterists claiming the Daniel 70 weeks ends at 80, 34, 35? It's just grammatically impossible, but yet some of these people just have these, they have to make that work somehow.
That's exactly right. I agree with that 100%. So to move on very quickly to get to where we want to go here, and again, setting the stage for next week. If it is true that Revelation chapter 20, 1 to 4 is about this, basically the same martyrs as chapter 6, then they're waiting for their vindication. Well, how long are they going to wait? Oh, for 1,000 years. Guess what? It appears to me, Mike, that in Revelation, we have a very clear definition of the millennium. Revelation chapter 6, they're given white robes, told to rest how long?
A little while.
A little while. Revelation chapter 12. The great serpent, the devil, Satan.
At a little while.
He had great wrath. He's pursuing the woman, but he has great wrath because he knows he has only a little while. A little while to do what? To persecute the church. So Revelation 6, saints had to rest for a little while. Revelation 12, Satan had great anger because he knew he had only a little while. Revelation chapter 20, the martyrs are going to rule for 1,000 years. So we have two statements of a little while. A little while in any human calculation is not 1,000 years. So obviously, men like Anthony Aquino would say, see, 1,000 years defines the little while. No, a twofold use of a little while defines 1,000 years and eliminates it as being a long time.
And I would note that the martyrs don't just represent people that have literally been beheaded. I would agree with Beale that the martyr theme also includes the persecution of the church. So that's why I would kind of, see it going back to AD 30 to, to 67 or so.
Let's be clear. My personal view is that the martyrs under the altar and the martyrs in Revelation 20 include the Old Covenant prophets. Because after all, Revelation chapter 16, verse 6 depicts the righteousness, the justice of God in judging Babylon. Why? Because she has slain the prophets.
Yeah.
Those are Old Covenant prophets. So while some of the premillennial preterists, for instance, they try to restrict the martyrs in Revelation chapter 21-4 as the martyrs strictly under Nero. Well, that doesn't work. That doesn't work at all. You have to create a completely sharp dichotomy between the martyrs of Revelation chapter 6 and the martyrs of Revelation chapter 20 in order to say, well, okay, you got martyrs in chapter 6, but they're different from these Neronian martyrs. Where do we get that idea? Both of them are slain for their faith.
I think that was the same issue that Anthony Aquino had, is he kept trying to connect everything with the mark of the beast and Nero.
Yes.
And not seeing a comprehensive issue with the martyrs going all the way back to Genesis and under Abel and the old, like you said, the Old Testament, and all of them waiting. He on top of that error, he didn't see the recapitulation.
Oh, that's a fundamental error of his situation. And by the way, some of the premillennial preterists are making the same identical error, because in this discussion that I had with my friend the other day, I said, okay, are the martyrs of Revelation 20 the same martyrs of chapter 6? He said, no. In the premillennial preterist circles that I see, they would say that chapter 6 is earlier and a different time. That's a massive problem. That is okay, if you're going to take that position, then what do you have to do? Well, in chapter 20, at the destruction of Satan, and thus the vindication of those in chapter 20, verse 1-4, you have the destruction of heaven and earth. Well, in chapter 6, in the vindication of those martyrs at the great day of God's wrath, you have the destruction of heaven and earth. In chapter 16, at the day of the Lord, Armageddon, by the way, in the vindication of the martyrs, you have the destruction of heaven and earth. So for those who want to take Revelation chapter 20 as a later time than Revelation chapter 6, you're going to have 3 different times of the destruction of heaven and earth in the book of Revelation.
Yeah, and that's what they're forced to do. They completely abandon the hermeneutical principle of recapitulation once they get to those 10 verses in Revelation 20:5-15. It just goes completely out the window. It's an island unto itself, because they realize that that's their great last stand.
And let's bring this home on the war, shall we?
Mm-hmm.
Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6 does not specifically mention the war, but here's what it does do, ladies and gentlemen. In response to the prayer of the martyrs under the altar, what do we find? We find the great and awesome day of the Lord, the great day of God's wrath, when, great day of God's wrath, Greek word orge, and that runs throughout Isaiah, but nonetheless, the great day of God's wrath for the vindication of the martyrs, that's chapter 16. So here we go again. Do we acknowledge recapitulation between chapter 6 and 16 If so, then we have two great days of God's wrath to vindicate the martyrs. That's problematic. Okay. And, okay, are you going to say that Revelation chapter 16 is the vindication of the prophets only versus who knows who in Revelation chapter 6, some generic base group of martyrs? No, that's not going to work. And once again, you got destruction of heaven and earth in Revelation 6 and Revelation chapter 16. So, I mean, unless we're willing to create this unbelievable unfolding narrative of destruction of heaven and earth here, and a few years later, destruction of heaven and earth, and then, oh, by the way, in chapter 19, another reference to the war. And by the way, to go back, Revelation chapter 6 doesn't mention the war, but it's the great day of God's wrath, which in Revelation 16 is the time of the war. And let me point this out in verse 14. John says, I saw three unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon, the mouth of the beast, and the mouth of the false prophet. These are spirits of demons performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. Well, that the term in the Greek is the polemos, and it's definite article, polemos. So it's not simply to gather them to battle, it is to gather them to the battle. Well, what battle has already been mentioned? Revelation 6. Revelation 6. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, Revelation 16 is the war, Revelation 19 is the war, and Revelation 20 is the war. But we have connectors, like Donna said, between Revelation 6 to Revelation 20. We also, which we didn't get to, we have connections to the war. Is it the war in Daniel 9:26?
Yes.
In the original? Okay, so we have the war, and I'm going to tie this in with Revelation 11 real quick.
Oh, yes.
So we don't have the war in Revelation 6 or 11, but they are describing the war because in Daniel 9, it is the war when the abomination of desolation takes place. Jesus connects that with when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, know that its desolation is near. Okay. So, and he says that he connects that to the times of the Gentiles treading down Jerusalem. Now that's that 3.5 years of Daniel 12, 7, which is Daniel 9, the very end of the 70 weeks. And that's Revelation 11, when the city where the Lord was crucified is trodden down by the Gentile nations for, again, 3.5 years, which was the time of the judgment of the dead. Okay, so that's clearly describing the war, according to Jesus in Luke 21 and Daniel. And so now you can connect Revelation 11 with the war of Revelation 16, 19, and 20, because the war ends in Revelation 20 with the judgment of the dead. And that's exactly a Revelation chapter 11 and what it teaches.
And Revelation chapter 11 has that other connector. It is the time for your wrath has come, or day.
Yes.
You know, here's the great day of God's wrath. Revelation 6, Revelation 16, the great day of God's wrath. Revelation chapter 11, your wrath has come.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, why would you want to butcher? I mean, especially when they all admit that it's recapitulation, and then their theology makes it, well, maybe not here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it gets back to that. You know, Mike, you and I both know how difficult it is to readily surrender traditions. It can be traumatic. It was for me. I know it was for you. Everybody that I know of. Well, I'll take that back. We're almost out of time. I'll share this, and then we'll have to close. While I was still at Maxwell Avenue Church of Christ here in Ardmore, the controversy was raging. There was a young woman, brilliant young woman, but she always taught Bible class. She had not been in my classes. Okay, so she didn't really understand what the issue was. She started hearing people talking about God's teaching false doctrine is, you know, blah, blah, blah. And here I'm sitting in my office one day, and I was really hard at it. And I look up, and here she comes. Now, mind you, this is a very strong-willed, fiery young woman. Okay. And I thought, oh boy, oh boy.
Which can be a blessing and a curse. It just depends on which way.
I didn't know if this was going to be fire and brimstone or if this was going to be, I'm sure glad somebody's teaching this. So anyway, came in, plopped down in a chair in front of me and said, okay, Don Preston, I want you to tell me exactly what it is you're teaching. I took my Bible, laid it down in front of her, and I said, turn to Matthew 16, 27, 28. She did. And she started reading it silently. I said, no. Read it out loud. She read it, and she looked up, and she said, okay. What? I said, read it again out loud. She read it again, and I think just a glimmer of a train's headlight in the far distant, I think it began to flicker, and she goes, okay. I said, okay, simple question. Verse 27, what did Jesus say he was going to do? Verse 28, tell me when he said he was going to do it. Well, again, she just looked down. I said, no, read it out loud. She read it out loud, and she goes, that's what this is all about? I said, yeah. I said, now you tell me. I said, I'm not saying a word. You tell me what Jesus said he was going to do when he said he was going to do it. And she said, he said he was going to come back in judgment. I said, okay, when? She said, in that lifetime, the lifetime of those people. I said, okay. I said, does the Church of Christ teach that he did that? That's when it hit her. And she goes, no. I said, okay. And she goes, so what's the problem? That's what it says.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and that was as simple as it was with her. Boom, bingo. That was it. And that was over. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do again next week, listen, if you have to listen to this program a couple of different times and to see all of these dots that are connecting between these passages and the references to the war, the references to the day of the Lord, the references to the day of wrath. Look at all of these consistent passages, or all of these passages with the consistent theme of martyr vindication and wrath on their persecutors. Once you see, ladies and gentlemen, once you see this harmony and unity, believe you me, you can never go back. You can never go back. Okay, well, folks, we are completely and totally out of time this evening. Thanks for joining us, Mike. Great time, as always, to be with you, my brother. I'm going to say good night. God bless.
Good night. Take care, guys.
All right, man.
Another good one.
You betcha. I'll get this processed, and I'll let it go on air tonight, and then I'll spread it to all of the Facebook pages that I use in the morning. Good night.
Gotcha. Good night.